Let yourself be misunderstood, not as a resignation, but as a genuine act of freedom. Because the energy you spend managing other people's perceptions of the things you love, pre-editing yourself before anyone's even asked, that energy has a cost. And I've been paying it for a long time. Hi everyone, I'm Lisa, and welcome back to Self-Awareness Sucks. Before we get into it, I just want to say I'm not a psychologist, a therapist, or a medical professional, and I'm not claiming to be, and I'm not here to give advice or a diagnosis. Everything I share in this podcast is based on my own experiences, thoughts, and observations. So please take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and if you are struggling with anything I mention, please do reach out to a qualified professional or at least someone you trust. Now, before we get started as well, I just want to flag something. A lot of what I talk about today centres around music. Not in a music review kind of way, and not because I think my taste is particularly interesting or worth documenting, but because music turned out to be one of the clearest places where I can trace a very specific pattern. The pattern of learning to keep quiet about the things you love. And I think that pattern is going to be familiar to you, even if the specific soundtrack is completely different. The title of this episode, as you've seen, is Let Yourself Be Misunderstood. And I want to be upfront about what that actually means, because it's not a passive thing. It's not about giving up on being understood or deciding that connection doesn't matter. It's about recognizing that the energy you spend managing other people's perceptions of the things you love, pre-editing yourself before anyone has even asked, keeping things private because of what happened the last time you shared them, that energy has a cost. And I personally have been paying for it for a long time. And these are just some of the moments where I can see exactly what that cost looked like. I want to start with a booklet. Year 6, the last year of primary school, so around 10 or 11 years old, before the transition to high school. And we were given these little booklets to fill in about ourselves. Name, favourite colour, favourite food, hobbies, all the standard things. And then there was a question about favourite music. And I remember panicking. Not in a really visible or dramatic way, but internally, in the way that children do when they suddenly become aware that their answer might be wrong. That it might reveal something about them that they think might not go down very well. And part of why I panicked was that I'd already spent so many years feeling like the dot outside the circle, which I've talked about extensively across the season and I won't go into again here. But the short version is that by this time this booklet arrived, I'd already accumulated enough data to know that being different was a liability. That the things you claimed publicly were the things you got judged on. And I had no way of knowing in advance whether my answer was going to be the right kind of answer or the wrong kind. I didn't know what to write. I didn't actually have a favourite artist at the time. This would have been 2010. So I'd had all of these experiences throughout primary school, the bullying that I have talked about, probably far too much at this point. And so I was feeling hyper aware of this answer that I needed to put down in this booklet. And I didn't want to leave it blank, but I also didn't want to put someone random because that wouldn't be true. And then I'd have to explain myself. And then anyone who did come to mind I wasn't sure if those preferences were acceptable ones. So I was 11 years old and already pre-editing myself before anyone had even asked for my opinion. And here's the thing that makes this both sad and a little bit funny in hindsight. The booklet was going to our new tutor group teacher in secondary school. For anyone outside the UK, a tutor group is basically a form group, a small group of students who are registered together, sometimes at the start of each school day, sometimes halfway through, and they have the same teacher as their pastoral point of contact. And this booklet was just so that they could get a sense of who we were before we arrived. But it was never going to come up. We were never going to have to introduce ourselves based on it. There were no profiles on the wall. Nobody was going to read out our answers. It was literally just a few pieces of paper for a teacher and nothing more. But I didn't know that at the time. And even if I had, I'm not sure it would have changed very much. Because the panic wasn't really about what would happen with the booklet. It was about what the answer said about me. Whether whatever I put down would be acceptable. Whether it would confirm, once again, that I was the wrong kind of person. And that's the self-awareness sucks moment before I even had self-awareness. My nervous system was running a risk assessment on a piece of paper that was going to sit in a teacher's filing cabinet and never be mentioned again. And the reason it was running that assessment is that I'd spent enough years having things used against me that I'd stopped being able to tell the difference. The difference between the things that mattered and the things that didn't. Everything felt like potential evidence. Everything felt like something that could be turned into a reason. And that booklet was the earliest version of what I talked about in episode 10, the editing process, deciding in advance what version of yourself is safe to put forward before anyone has even asked. And I was doing that at 11 years old with a question about my favourite musical artist. And so that moment is where this episode starts. Not because it's the most painful moment in it, but because it's the earliest. And everything else follows from it. A couple of years into high school, so around 12 or 13, I went to a Rebecca Ferguson concert with my dad. And it was a small thing, but I remember with what I'm about to tell you, it actually really hurt me. Now, if you don't know who Rebecca Ferguson is, not the actress, there was a contestant on The X Factor, and she has this extraordinary voice, very distinct, very moving. And her music isn't mainstream pop. It's not the kind of thing that comes up in conversation at school. But my family loved her and I loved her, and I went to the concert and it was genuinely wonderful, and it's a really fond memory that I share with my dad. And so the next day I went into school, and here's the detail that matters, but it's also kind of strange. I distinctly remember that we all used to sit there sometimes with one earphone in, half listening to music whilst also having a conversation or multiple conversations. And that was kind of the context for sharing music with each other. And we were sat there having our lunch, and I mentioned the concert, and I'd said I'd been to see Rebecca Ferguson. And the thing is, nobody asked how it was. Nobody asked to see or hear a clip. Nobody said, "Oh, I've not really listened to her, what's she like?" What I got was quite an intense response, quite impassioned responses about the same thing, and it was that, "Oh, she's so crap, why would you listen to her? She's not even a good singer." And I was quite taken aback at the time, because this was a group of friends that we'd become very close and tight-knit. And for me in that moment, from the group I had been working so hard to feel inside the circle with, the people I was finally, after years of feeling like the dot outside the circle, starting to feel a sense of community with, I got a response that made me feel like I was back on the outside. And not because of anything I'd done wrong, it was just because I'd offered something that didn't really fit. And they'd let me know it didn't fit in the way that teenagers sometimes do, without really thinking about the cost of it. And it did hurt in a very specific way. It wasn't just the rejection of the music, but it was the rejection for the bid for connection. I was trying to share something I genuinely loved, and what came back was contempt. And the message I took from it, even if it wasn't the message that was intended, was, that part of you is not welcome here. That's genuinely how it felt in the moment. I was very, very upset at the time. And if I think about it, this is where episode 5 started, if I trace it back far enough. To be cringe is to be free. But I didn't know that yet. What I knew was that sharing something you love and having it dismissed is one of the fastest ways to learn that loving things openly is a risk. And I started managing that risk earlier than I even realised. The earphones went in, and I learned that some things were safer kept to myself. And that's just the first version of it I can point to. Me feeling back outside the circle, not because of who I was, but because of what I loved. And the lesson I took from it at the time, without knowing I was taking a lesson, was that some things are safer kept private. That letting people know what you actually love is a risk. And that's not a conscious decision. It's just the thing that happens when you share something and it doesn't go the way you hoped. You start to misunderstand yourself on other people's behalf. You start to preempt the dismissal. And that's the trap this whole episode is about. Because humans are communal creatures. And this isn't just a nice sentiment, it's something that research backs quite strongly. Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary have written about what they call the need to belong. The idea that the drive for interpersonal connection is a fundamental human motivation, as basic as hunger or safety. Not something that we want on top of everything else, but something that we actually need. And I've been thinking about this in the context of what seems like a very small story about a concert and a dismissive comment, because I think it's easy to minimise these moments and hard to sit with what they're actually about. When you share something you love and it gets shut down, the sting isn't really about the thing. It's about the bid. You were offering a piece of yourself in the hope of finding common ground. You were reaching toward community, and the door didn't open. And I was reminded of this recently when there was a debate in my family about my niece getting her ears pierced. She's young, and there was a conversation about whether she was being peer pressured into it. Whereas my argument was, I don't think that's quite what's happening. I think what she wants is to feel included, to feel like she's part of something, and that's not peer pressure. All of her friends have had their ears pierced, and so I think it is just the primal human impulse to belong. But it's just that kids don't have the language for it yet, and they're not conscious of the mechanics of it, but that's what it is. The same impulse that made me want to share Rebecca Ferguson with my friends, and the same impulse that made the dismissal hurt. And there is a specific version of the Year 6 booklet that I now understand better. At the time, I genuinely didn't have a favourite artist. And so I was vague with my answers because I was being careful. But I think there's another layer to it, which at the time, music, and it still does now, but music felt deeply personal, and that it was a very clear indicator of who you were as a person within the social hierarchy. And there was very clear distinctions with your likes and dislikes, particularly in 2010. So for me, it wasn't just background noise, and it wasn't just something we all sort of shared without it meaning much. There was an intrinsic link between you and your preferences. And so I didn't want to put something that wasn't true in that booklet, but I also didn't know what to put. And over time, it only started to feel more personal. The more musicians I discovered that I really liked, I struggled with, really, in hindsight, because I was already in an environment where I'd learned that sharing the personal things was risky. So by the time I had music I genuinely loved, I was already primed to keep quiet about it. The booklet was asking a question I didn't feel like I had a safe answer to. Not because the answer didn't exist, but because the safe version of the answer and the true version of the answer had already started to diverge. And so at the start of university, I kind of tried this again. I shared a song by 5 Seconds of Summer, and they'd released a single from the third album that they were doing at the time. And I sent it with genuine enthusiasm, the way you do when you've been a fan of something for years and you just want someone else to feel it too. And the response that I got was that it's cute. And this is one of the clearest examples I have of what it looks like to be misunderstood and to let that misunderstanding change your behaviour. Not because the misunderstanding was accurate, but because I didn't have the tools yet to let it be inaccurate and keep going anyway. And it's not like it was a mean comment, because 5 Seconds of Summer do not make cute music. That's not really what they do. And so that comment for me wasn't just a dismissal of my taste. It was a fundamental misreading of the thing itself. There was no, it's not really for me, but I can see why you like it. No acknowledgement of what the song was actually doing. Just cute. Dropped like a lid on a box, and the conversation moved on. And I genuinely didn't know what to do with that. Because what are you meant to say back to cute? There's no argument to be had. There's no ground to defend. The word just sits there, small and final, and you're left holding something you loved and being told, essentially, that it's minor. I could probably defend my position and my preference for it now much better, but at the time I didn't even think of that as an option, and I didn't have the vocabulary or the understanding to make an argument. And this was at the start of university, and I was already in the middle of the identity wobble I talked about in episode 12. I wasn't feeling confident in my skin, I wasn't feeling physically healthy, I wasn't feeling like the strongest person in the room anymore academically, which had been the one thing I'd always been able to count on. And all of that was already present when I sent that song. And 5 Seconds of Summer was one of the threads of myself I was trying to carry forward. They were my teenage years in music, and they meant something to me. And I'd offered that carefully and hopefully, and gotten an answer that was quite disappointing back. And this is episode 15 playing out in the most personal way I can describe. Context really does change everything, because the cute response wasn't about 5 seconds of summer. It was about a version of me that person didn't have the context to understand. They were responding to the surface, not to what was underneath it. But as I've mentioned, I didn't have that framework at the time. All I had was the data point, and I filed it away. So once again, I stopped offering. Not really consciously, but gradually, I just stopped mentioning them and stopped bringing them up and let that thread of myself go quiet. And I think what happened in hindsight is that I was gripping so hard at creating a clean slate, at being someone different, a more interesting version of myself, that when I shared something I loved and didn't get the reaction I wanted, rather than standing by it, I let it confirm a story that I was already running about what was and wasn't acceptable about me. And I talked about gripping the outcome so tightly in episode 13 to the point where there's no actual room for the thing to breathe. And that's what I was doing with my own identity at university. I was holding so hard to the version I wanted to project that I started releasing the things that were actually mine. And I became, in that particular way, an echo of myself. Not the full thing, just a quieter, more curated version that was safer to show people. And the frustrating thing, looking back, is that I already had shared interests with the friends I made at university. We had plenty of common ground. But it was specifically this one thread that didn't get the response I wanted. And somehow that one unshared thing became heavier than all the things we did share. And it just sat there, the thing that nobody got, and accumulated weight. And this is the shadow from episode 8 in its most everyday form. Not a dramatic hidden thing, just the accumulated weight of choosing the quieter version of yourself so many times that it starts to feel like who you are. And in this same period, around university and a couple of years after, I got very in my head about music taste in general. And I remember during lockdown specifically getting stuck in this loop of wondering whether my taste was actually good, whether I had discernment, whether the things I loved were objectively worthwhile or just things I happened to like. And here's the self-awareness sucks moment in all of that, because once you start analysing your own taste, you can't just enjoy the thing anymore. You're too busy interrogating whether you're allowed to. Which, when I say out loud now, is obviously a bit ridiculous. Because what even constitutes good music taste? I mean, there are probably songs out there that are objectively badly made, but there's no bad genre, no bad artist by default. I don't like metal, but I know people who love it, and it does something real for them. But the category of good music taste is almost entirely constructed. It's a social performance. It's the Rebecca Ferguson moment in a different form. The question isn't whether your taste is good. The question is whose approval you're trying to earn by having it. And around this same time, I discovered a genre of YouTube content that I loved. And it was vocal coaches reacting to singers, watching musical professionals analyse the technical qualities of performances I already found moving. And it was just this perfect combination of things I cared about. Music, analysis, and someone else articulating why something was good in terms I found satisfying. And I think it was because I just wanted that connection of someone who appreciated the artist in the same way that I did. But I watched it alone. I didn't share it, I didn't mention it. Not because I was ashamed of it exactly, but because I'd learned something about the cost of sharing things that not everyone would understand. And this felt like something not everyone would get. So I kept it private. I built a little world around it that existed just for me. And that's the faking fear from episode 11 in one of its subtlest forms. It wasn't a dramatic avoidance, it was just a gradual decision to enjoy things in a smaller space than they deserved. And I think there's a difference between keeping something private because you want it to be yours and keeping something private because you're preempting the dismissal. One comes from a place of abundance, and the other comes from learned smallness. And for a long time, unfortunately, mine was the second one. So it's 3 different things: the concert, the song, the YouTube content. 3 different versions of the same experience. Here's what I love. Here's me deciding not to share it. Here's the misunderstanding I was preempting before it even happened. And the title of this episode is the answer to all 3 of them. Let yourself be misunderstood. Because I think the alternative, the pre-editing, the quieter version of yourself, the echo instead of the full thing, costs more than the dismissal ever would have. And following on from that, I want to talk about the feeling of when you discover something or someone early, because I think it gets misread as gatekeeping, and that's not quite what it is. So once again, I'm going to get very specific and personal, but as an example, there are a couple of artists that I found quite early. One of them was Billie Eilish, and I discovered her in 2017 after her song Ocean Eyes was used in a film. And for a while, it was just that one song. And then in the summer of 2018, I started pushing her music on anyone who would listen. My friends, my mum, anyone in the vicinity. Have you heard this? You need to hear this. And then she very quickly released Bad Guy, and the whole world knew who she was. But I wanted to share her music specifically because her lyrics were so beautiful and they had such meaning that I wanted to discuss them with someone. And then similarly with another artist, Ren, who I've mentioned before, but it's a slightly longer story. And my mum actually saw him busking in Brighton around 2014 or 15, which is extraordinary in retrospect. And then she shared a video of him on my Facebook years later in 2018 that I reposted without fully connecting the dots. And then in 2019, a song came up on Spotify and I added it to a playlist. And then, of course, lockdown happened. And from April to December of 2020, I listened to basically nothing else but his music. There's just something about it that still does, but particularly then, scratched an itch in my brain that nothing else was reaching. And it wasn't until partway through that year that I realised this was the same person my mum had seen busking. And since 2024, his popularity has only grown. And I've seen other creators, other artists, producers, vocal coaches reacting to his music and appreciating the lyricism and his talent in the same way that I did when I first discovered him and was listening to him back in 2020. And that's a sense of community that I think that's what I discovered when the vocal coaches earlier on, which I mentioned. And it's only as I'm thinking about it now that I'm like, oh, that's why I enjoyed watching that content so much, because it was that analysis, it was that appreciation for the composition of the music and what it was making you feel that made me feel connected to someone, because I hadn't been able to share it with people around me in real life. But the feeling of the wider community, the global community, discovering something that was quite close to you or private to you, I don't think the feeling that comes with all of that is ownership. I don't own these artists, I never did. What it is, I think, is something closer to grief for a specific kind of intimacy. When you find something before everyone else, the relationship with it is quieter and more private and more purely yours. You found it or them when there was no fame attached to it yet, when there was no pressure around, when you could just love it wholeheartedly without context or crowd. And then when it becomes everyone's, that specific quality changes and you gain a different kind of community, but you lose the quietness. And as I said, I tried to share both of them with people around me and had limited success. And then they got big, and truthfully, I had that very specific feeling of, I told you so, but to nobody. Because the people I tried to tell had already moved on, and the ones who are now fans had found it in their own way. So that I told you so had nowhere to go. Which is actually kind of the point. The knowing was never about the recognition, it was about the wanting to share. And when the sharing didn't happen, what lingered wasn't smugness, it was the wish that someone had been there with me at the beginning. And before I had this podcast, before I started it, I actually had quite a few imaginary conversations in my head. And I was thinking about what it would be like to mention it to either people at work or friends or just people I know, and to say casually, oh, I've got a podcast. And I imagined the reactions. But for some reason, I didn't default to the warm ones. I defaulted to the ones with the particular air of, who does she think she is? Not said out loud, just kind of present in their reaction. The mild bemusement of this person starting something that everyone seems to be doing, and the polite non-interest. And I have talked about that narrative before, the who does she think she is voice, the shadow belief that something visible invites a verdict. But what I realised in that imagined conversation and in those imagined conversations was something specific. I thought, in 5 years, if we're not in contact anymore, are they really going to be thinking about this? Probably not. Are they going to remember that I mentioned a podcast? Probably not. So why is the imagined version of their imagined reaction stopping me from doing something I actually want to do? And that thought was both sobering and freeing. It was sobering because it confirmed that some people just aren't going to be your community, and no amount of carefully managing the reveal is going to change that. Freeing because it means their opinion has a shelf life. It expires, and the thing you wanted to do outlasts it. And interestingly, my reaction to thinking about all of this was, watch me. Just watch me do it. Which is the other side of who does she think she is and that entire narrative. I think it's the answer to it. It's not justification or defensiveness. It's literally just, watch me. Watch me prove you wrong. Which also connects to a phrase that I've been sitting for a while now. And it's only something that I said to myself not too long ago. And I said, I've had too many regrets in my life to stop here now. But I want to come back to both of those properly in the season finale because that's where they belong. But I just wanted to plant them here first because this is the episode where I finally understand what they actually mean. Not the concert, not any single moment, but the whole pattern. The years of pre-editing, of filing the wrong data points, of being the echo instead of the full thing. I've had too many regrets built from that pattern to keep adding to it. And somewhere between the Year 6 booklet and singing every single word of a 5 Seconds of Summer song in a room full of people, I decided I was done. And I mentioned in the last episode that I went to a 5 Seconds of Summer concert earlier this year with my cousin. But what I didn't say was what that actually felt like from the inside. Because the experience wasn't just good, it was fulfilling. I was singing every word and I wasn't apologising for knowing every word and I wasn't managing how that looked from the outside. I was just completely, fully inside it and enjoying the thing I'd half hidden for years and let it be as big as it actually was. And after that, I thought about the university moment and the cute comment and the years of letting that thread of myself go quiet. And then I thought about all the times I'd made myself smaller to fit into spaces that were never going to fully receive me anyway. And what I'd wish I'd known, what I wish I could tell the version of me at the start of university who sent that 5 Seconds of Summer song and got cute back, is this. You should have gone 10 toes down. You should have wholeheartedly shared your interests and not managed the reaction in advance. And if people had wanted to come with you, great. You'd have found your community around it. And if they hadn't, that would have been information. Useful information about who your actual people are. Either way, you would have been more fully yourself. And that version of things would have been better than the echo. But simultaneously, I have to be kind to that past self because she really was going through it. But here's what I've come to understand about the things that linger. The unshared interest doesn't linger more than the shared ones because it's more important. I think it lingers because it's the moment where a choice was made, even if you didn't know you were making it. You offered something close to your heart, you imagined a desired reaction, and the reaction you got wasn't the one you wanted. And at that point, you either carry the disappointment quietly, letting it confirm that this part of you is too much or too niche or too something, or you make the decision to enjoy the thing anyway, to separate its value from whether anyone else validates it. But the problem is you have to know that choice exists. Without the self-awareness, the disappointment just accumulates. The shrinking happens gradually without a decision point you can look back at and name. It becomes background noise of who you are. A slightly smaller version of yourself than you started with. And I'm not going to pretend the letting go is clean, that it's easy, because you'll still want the community. And that wanting doesn't just disappear because you've given yourself permission to exist without external validation. Humans need connection, and that need doesn't switch off. But I do think that there is something that makes it easier. And I have to say from experience, it's gratitude. Now, I'm not trying to diminish emotions or experiences. I'm not trying to put it all down with, oh, you should just be grateful. I'm saying it because I think it helps alleviate some of the weight. I think that when you are genuinely grateful for something, you stop needing other people to confirm it. The joy becomes self-sufficient. I'm grateful I found Ren before anyone else was really talking about him, and that I got to sit with his music alone for months during lockdown when I really needed it. I'm grateful that I went to that Rebecca Ferguson concert with my dad, and that we both loved it, and that we still talk about it now, 13 years later. I'm grateful that 5 Seconds of Summer have been making music my entire adult life, and that I went to that concert this year and sang every word with my full chest. And none of that requires anyone else's agreement. It's already real. It's already enough. And when something is already enough, the misunderstanding stops being a wound and becomes just a fact. They don't get it. That's fine. I do. And there's a whole conversation to be had about gratitude and self-awareness, and about what practicing genuine gratitude does to the need for external validation. But I'll leave that for another day. What I will say is just this. It makes letting yourself be misunderstood significantly easier. Because the thing you love stops depending on other people's reactions to exist properly. It's already whole. And this takes us back to episode 4, how free will is reason enough. If it makes you happy and you're not hurting anyone, that's reason enough. There is no justification required. There's no verdict needed. It's just the thing and the fact that it matters to you, which is always going to be sufficient. So like most episodes, I know this one has been specific. Very specific. With, once again, my particular artists that I listen to and the particular moments that I've experienced and particular versions of a feeling I've carried for a long time. And I want to be clear that I'm not sharing on any of it to trauma dump or just get it off my chest. I'm sharing it because I think that we've all had a version of it in just a different format. And maybe it wasn't music. Maybe it was a film or a series of films or a franchise or a genre or a book or a hobby or a passion or just something you felt deeply about that someone rolled their eyes at or made a joke about. And you've kept it private ever since because of how that felt the one time you shared it. And what I've described today is just one of the specific things that made me feel that particular way. The pattern underneath it is probably something you recognise, and that recognition is the whole point of this podcast. Not the music, not my specific stories, but the feelings underneath them. So I want to reiterate the title of this episode very clearly before I close it off, because I don't want it to get lost in everything else I've said today. Let yourself be misunderstood. Not as a resignation, not as giving up on being understood, but as a genuine act of freedom. Because here's the thing. If people don't get you, it does not matter. And I cannot stress that enough. As long as you aren't hurting anyone, as long as you're not doing it at anyone else's expense, what you love, what brings you joy, what you find meaningful, none of that requires anyone else's approval to be valid. And I've said this before, but it's worth saying again. Our lifespan, even at its most generous, is a drop in the ocean compared to the span of history that's already happened and everything that's still to come. The things you liked, the things that made you cringe to other people, the music, the hobby, the passion, the interest that nobody else got. In the grand scheme of things, none of that matters to anyone but you. And that, I think, is actually a good thing, because it means you're free to just enjoy it. Which brings me to another phrase that I've actually returned to over the years. And it's that if you don't like me, that's your problem, not mine. Now, I came up with that when I was a teenager, so I recognise the nuance in that now, which I'll acknowledge, and it's that if you've genuinely done something to hurt someone, then it's not entirely their problem. But in the context of being misunderstood, of people not getting your taste or your interests or the version of you that you're putting forward, that phrase is actually really useful because it reframes the whole thing. You're not waiting for their verdict. You're not managing their reaction. You're just being yourself and letting them do whatever they want with that information. And I said that to myself a lot during the years when I felt the most misunderstood. And every time I actually believed it, even briefly, it helped. It got me out of my head. It loosened the grip on the need to be received correctly. Because some people just aren't your tribe. They're not your community. They're not your people. And some people aren't going to get it. And that's not a failure on your part. It's just information about fit. And you might actually find, if you let yourself be misunderstood, that you end up with a stronger community than if you'd spent all that energy curating yourself for the wrong audience. The people who do get you, who meet the unedited version of you and stay, those connections are real in a way that the carefully managed ones never quite are. Because they're not responding to a performance, they're responding to you. So if people want to misunderstand you, let them. It's not my problem, and it's not yours either. So this episode's Uncomfortably Honest is this. There are things I stopped sharing for so long that I almost forgot they were mine. The music, the fan fiction, the specific corner of YouTube I loved, the interests that felt too niche or too much or too easily dismissed. And the grief of that isn't the loss of the things themselves, because I still had them. It's the loss of the sharing. The years of enjoying things in a smaller, quieter way than they deserved. The echo instead of the full thing. And I can't get those years back. But I stopped adding to that particular regret somewhere around the start of this podcast. And that's something. So here's what I want to leave you with. Is there something you've been keeping quieter than it deserves to be? Something you love that you've learned not to mention because the last time you mentioned it, the reaction wasn't what you hoped. And you don't have to defend it. You don't have to justify it. You don't have to get anyone's agreement before you're allowed to love it fully. Let yourself be misunderstood and let yourself enjoy the thing anyway. If what I've talked about today resonated, I think that you'll find episode 5 interesting. To be cringe is to be free. It's where I get into why the fear of being seen as too much is one of the most specific ways self-awareness can work against you. And this episode is, in many ways, where that fear first got installed. So, if you want to be there for the next one, hitting follow or subscribe means you won't miss it. There are new episodes every week. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!